Hello. Hello and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library. Is anyone here visiting us for the first time tonight? 4 people, 5 people. That's enough for me to briefly explain our history to you. We've been in operation for over 100 years. We're the largest English language lending library on the European continent. And over this period of time, we've been the intellectual home to figures such as Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Edith Wharton, and we remain a living cultural center today, hosting programs like the one you're about to sit through, as well as a robust fellowship program, which you're also going to learn about because the lovely Lauren Oyler was a part of it. A couple of notes about tonight's conversation before we dive in. After about 45 minutes, we'll be opening it up to questions from our in-person audience and our Zoom audience if we have time. So if you're on Zoom, send your questions in the chat. Hello, Zoom audience, inside that camera right there. And if you're in person, just sit tight. And copies of A Life of One's Own will be available for purchase following this event, thanks to our generous partner booksellers, Smith & Son. There are no copies of No Judgment available because Lauren is too popular and they were sold out. So sorry about that. Tonight, it is such a pleasure and such a privilege to be joined by the fantastic, brilliant Joanna Biggs, of no relation to me, Emily Biggs, though it's always a delight to meet another Biggs, in conversation with Lauren Oyler as they discuss A Life of One's Own. Joanna Biggs is an editor at Harper's Magazine, and A Life of One's Own, 9 Women Writers Begin Again, was a New York Times spring pick and was shortlisted for the Martfield Prize and National Award for Arts Writing. The book earned Biggs a grant from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, and her writing has appeared in the London Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books. While she now lives in New York, where she is working on a novel, she lived in the 12e arrondissement in 2003 when the price of a demi-baguette was 20 cents. So a long, long time ago. And tonight, Joanna is joined by the brilliant Lauren Oyler, who is back for round 2 in the reading room. Lauren was Scholar of Note at the library in November, where she led a brilliant workshop on criticism. So it's such a delight to have her in the interviewing seat this time. Lauren's essays on books and culture appear regularly in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's, and the London Review of Books, and many other publications. She is the author of the novel Fake Accounts and an essay collection, No Judgment, which was published this year. So Joanna, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Can we have a big round of applause?
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks for being here. Just some context. I have known Joanna for, 6 years, and she has been my editor at both the LRB and at Harper's. So if there is a friendly vibe between us, that's why. And we will talk a little bit about her work as an editor. But first, I think we're going to have her read a little bit from A Life of One's Own so that you can get a sense for the book.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all so much for being here. I was just on the metro, so I know it wasn't necessarily easy to get here, so thank you. In honor of that time of Paris, I'm going to read from the section about Simone de Beauvoir, the essay. And a bit about, well, we'll soon see. I won't tell you too much about it. In the epilogue to Force of Circumstance, Beauvoir said that there had been one undoubted success in my life, my relationship with Sartre. She explained that they had only once, and only for one night, been at odds. They reasoned together, shared the same body of reference. We might also be said to think in common. She added that this might seem to contradict what she says about how important independence should be to women in the second sex, but she made a distinction. I insist that women be independent, yet I have never been alone. That delicate, perhaps utopian balance, togetherness not encroaching on independence, was present in the way she and Sartre conceived of their relationship from the beginning. Theirs being the essential love, they wouldn't lie to each other about contingent lovers. They would try this lease for 2 years while they were both in Paris, and then renegotiate, in the belief that they would be separated for 2 or 3 more years. Beauvoir remembered feeling a flicker of fear over this arrangement, a feeling she immediately subdued. Scholars, including Toril Moy, have seen her acceptance of the pact as a strategy for dealing with her fear of losing Sartre, but she seemed to have suffered all the same. Deirdre Baer, her biographer, says that nearly all Beauvoir's friends remember her sometimes leaving the cafe table during evenings with the family, Beauvoir and Sartre's name for the group of ex and current lovers they socialized with, to go and sit alone at another table, to consume vast quantities of wine and sob uncontrollably. Beauvoir herself talks of the jealousy she suffered the first time Sartre took another lover, and of the moment my heart's old armour of optimism fell away, when he told her of the weeks he'd spent in New York falling in love with Dolores Vanetti, to whom he would propose marriage. If writing a novel, which became She Came to Stay, about sharing a lover that ends in the established woman killing the newcomer, isn't a sign of distress, what is? Generations of feminists have asked the question, never expressed better than by Angela Carter. Why is a nice girl like Simone wasting her time sucking up to a boring old fart like JP? At the end of the first year of the Sartre-Beauvoir Pact, marked by that first experience of jealousy, which she dispelled by walking up and down the Boulevard de Montmartre, Beauvoir went to Marseille to teach. Sartre proposed to her so that they wouldn't have to be separated. I may say that not for one moment was I tempted to fall in with his suggestions, Beauvoir writes in The Prime of Life, adding that the task of preserving my independence was not particularly onerous. I would have regarded it as highly artificial to equate Sartre's absence with my own freedom, a thing I could find, honestly, I could only find, honestly, within my own head and heart. 12 years later, she wrote about this important decision in different terms. I very strongly wished not to leave Sartre. I chose what was the hardest course for me at that moment in order to safeguard the future. There is a complex idea of independence here. It can't be defined by leaving Sartre, and it can't be achieved by staying with him when she wanted to. If any man had proved sufficiently self-centered and commonplace to attempt my subjugation, she writes about the fear of abandoning herself to love, a fear that comes up again and again. I would have judged him, found him wanting, and left him. Perhaps Beauvoir's independence was achieved in the way she describes it in The Prime of Life, by working determinately at her teaching at the Lycée during the week, and hiking in the Calanque and at the Côte d'Azur at the weekends, daily and unaided, fashioning my own happiness. I think I'm going to leave her there happy. I think I'm going to tell you what happens next. Some of you probably already know.
Thank you. I love that part, and I wrote some notes about it, so I'm glad that that's the part that you read. So you do something kind of naughty in that passage, which gets at the broader project of this book, which one of the reviews called part memoir, part history, and part quest, right? And the thing that you do that's a bit naughty is you sort of flagrantly read one of de Beauvoir's novels biographically. And the sort of your sort of guilt or tentativeness or desire to read these 9 women writers, read their sort of fiction especially, or poetry as the case may be, biographically is a theme throughout the book. And in the Virginia Woolf chapter, you write something similar. Reading Woolf's account of the beginnings of To the Lighthouse, it is strange to me that anyone ever talks of books apart from a writer's life and her obsessions, as we did at university. Even if a book is about everything else, it is never not about the life the writer lived. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your sort of, for lack of a better word, journey as a critic, starting in university, which you discuss here, and these sort of not conflicts, but you talk about turning to literature for your own sort of biographical purposes and wanting to read in this way, and then being told no.
Yeah, I think I read naturally a bit more like this biographically as a young woman, when I was first reading things passionately, coming across Jane Eyre and things, and being interested in how should a woman be? I mean, not to rip off Sheila Heti, but to be inspired by her. And when I got to university, I was told I wasn't allowed to do that. We weren't allowed to read biography at all. We were allowed to read the actual work and either analyze it very closely on the page or then look at the secondary literature. And that's not a bad thing to do to an 18-year-old who has romantic ideas about literature. That's not the wrong thing to do. It's just that it somehow felt a bit, when I came to know writers as an editor, it seemed like the most limiting way of seeing it. I knew them as people. I could see what their writing was often reflecting what was happening in their real lives, because I knew their real lives. And I don't think any of these women sat down at their desks when it sort of wasn't cool to do that, when they wrote under pseudonyms, to just not say something about life that they'd learned. And when I was really struggling in my own life, when my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, when I was divorcing, when I was depressed, I was always thinking, how else did other people handle this? And sometimes that information is in their novels, even if we want to read not biographically, unfortunately.
But why do you think we're not supposed to read this way, right? I mean, I do think that, do you think that there's still resistance to this in sort of contemporary literary criticism? Because, I mean, I guess this also sort of gets at a question I was going to ask later, which is, you know, you talk a lot about your life in this book and you sort of reveal personal details. And you kind of don't want critics to... you want them to read those the right way, right? And you don't want them to write about it in a way that is too personal, right? So I guess, you know, what are like the dangers of reading in this way, the way that you do throughout this book, very beautifully, but where might you have gone wrong? Terribly, terribly wrong.
In loads of ways, I think. I think taking the wrong... Obviously, you write a novel with a character to create some distance, and if I sort of was not interested in that distance. I was interested in collapsing it completely. I think taking a character which is not a real person as a real person. I think thinking I can become like a Madame Bovary and read in novels, and thinking that not seeing the art and the kind of form and being a critic and losing my mind like that. Sort of melting into the books and like seeing myself constantly everywhere I look, in the novels, in my life, and just, yeah, I can see why they didn't want me to do it at university. But I do think there is a lot to be gained from it, because I think that before I left for Paris, I had dinner with the book editor in New York, and she was saying, one thing that the book does is let people in on the sort of reading that we all do. We do when we talk to each other about the books that we're reading, when we all were reading the Ferrante novels in this kind of feverish way and talking about Lila and Lenu and who we were and who we weren't. And that felt really vital and exciting in a way that reading a book just to learn about the development of the novel didn't feel exciting.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Ferrante. So also, I interviewed Joe about this book a year ago when it came out, and I wanted to ask about this, but we didn't have time. So now, look, I got another chance. So Ferrante is an interesting person in this book, right? Because she doesn't exist. You know, Elena Ferrante is a pseudonym. We sort of do know who corresponds to that pseudonym, but particularly as Anglophone writers, it sort of means it's like some Italian woman, you know. So it's like, I don't care. It might as well be anyone. And so in the Ferrante chapter is very interesting, because you have this, you know, I don't want to give the book away, but you have this kind of reading group where you bring all your friends together and you talk about the Ferrante novels. And I wonder what you think, how writing that chapter was different from writing the others, and if you know, what do we know about Ferrante, the person, just from reading her fiction, right? And like, how do you read? Because there was always, I mean, during the Ferrante fever era, which was 2015, you know, people were always sort of trying to figure out who she was. And then there was this bit in the United States, there was a sort of overblown uproar, if you recall, when some Italian journalists sort of revealed her identity, which Italians said, well, yeah, everybody knew that already. It wasn't a big deal. But in the US, people were writing these long sort of defenses of Elena Ferrante's right to anonymity, right? And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, and how she sort of differs for you, and if you were upset that her identity was revealed as well.
I was just thinking that's a quite good response to your previous question in some ways. It's like the gift of the fact that she doesn't tell us anything. It means that it becomes more of a mystery. Maybe we come together in a different way. Like, it gave me a chance to think about what what her writing meant to us and what that meeting meant to us and that period of my life and what that book gave us, in a way that not having to sit there and say she was born in this part of Italy in that year. But in fact, what she's done is really interesting in that way. So she hasn't given us the biographical details. She has given us some because she's given a lot of interviews, but she's talked a lot about the intellectual milieu that brought those books about. So the particular kind of sorts of like Italian feminist writing that brought that book together, the things that we can read now that we couldn't, the Natalia Ginsburg, all of that stuff that's kind of influenced everyone from like Sally Rooney to all sorts of people. And that has been a huge gift. It's almost like she gave us the gift of those evenings and all of the other books that she's brought about, all the books we were interested in. I don't really care who she is. I'm happy for her to stay anonymous. I don't really see why, if it if it brings more books about, that's the kind of the main thing that we need, right? That she actually we need to give her the conditions to write the best stuff she writes, and that's what I feel like as a editor as well. Like, what can I do to make Lauren write the best piece that she can write? Like, and that's why it's okay for her not to tell us who she is.
Do you consider her anonymity or pseudonymity a part of the project, or because you just talked about it as the condition she needs, right? But why do you assume it's not part of the whole thing, right?
Is that what you think?
Well, I would be hesitant to say so because I don't know that much about contemporary Italian literature because I don't speak Italian. But certainly, if you were analyzing the reception in the Anglophone world, right? Like it did have an effect on how you read the novels, right?
You mean it made it more glamorous?
Yeah. Well, it also just made it a little bit four-dimensional, right? And also, that was the time when autofiction was so popular, and everybody, Knausgaard was also coming out in English and American in English in the same time, and so you had this kind of foil to that, and all the rumor, like you can read it that way, I guess is what I'm saying, but you don't think so? Do you agree?
I know, I really do think about it in the sense of what she needed to write those books, yeah. And I do sometimes think, I can see what you mean now. Maybe if it was more constructed and we imagine that, so say the Neapolitan Quartet is just biographical and that is just what she lived and she wrote it down. But that's clearly not what's going on because of the way that the story is managed over the 4 volumes and the huge way it's done and the particular like integration of the political and the... but I do, yeah. I really do think of it as the condition she needed, I think.
Well, it also brings me to the question about, so each chapter, the title is the woman's first name, right? And that is also, the way you're talking about Elena Ferrante is, as if you're her friend, right? That's what she needs to do the books. Like, don't sully it with gossip. Like, don't talk about Lenny that way. Don't talk about Lenny that way. And I wonder if what made you do that? What made you use the first names for each essay? And if that took a long time or if it was just natural.
The way I worked on each of these essays was that I would read the whole of the writer's work chronologically. And that might mean starting with their first letters, Sylvia Plath's first letters from camp to her parents, and ending up really with the last letter she wrote to her psychoanalyst the week before she died. So, and I'd stop, every time they'd finished a work of art, I would stop and just read that. And so there was a period of my life where I was, going to work, coming home, just reading Plath. And so I suppose it did seem at those levels that I was becoming very close to them and that I had a version of them of my own as well. And that I'm not sure they would... I think some of them I could be friends with, but I think Plath in particular probably wouldn't like me. She'd find me too earnest. She wouldn't think I was cool. She would... I don't know, she would not be down with who I am. And I think other writers are a bit like that too, and I suppose that's another thing about coming too close to them, is you realise, if you're really trying to see them truly, you realise that you wouldn't be, I wouldn't even be the fan that they would choose. So sometimes I think, like, me using their name is a great liberty, but I just, in some ways, I'm sort of signaling to the reader, this is my version of them. And actually, you can have your own version of them too. You can have your own version of Sylvia and Mary Wollstonecraft and George Eliot. And you're sort of allowed that. We are allowed that as readers. So maybe it was like permission I gave myself to also see writers that I've been intimidated by for a long time. Like, Beauvoir wrote philosophy, she wrote plays, she wrote political tracts, she wrote novels, she wrote letters. It's just a huge amount, and it's an incredibly impressive career in the time when women didn't really have those careers. So sometimes I was like trying to trick myself and say, oh, just my friend Simone. I'm just going to read her next book and see how she's doing. You know, it was like that as well.
Well, because I think there is also an argument. So, I mean, I think I've seen this around because I do this too. Well, I refer to certain women writers by their first name.
Which ones?
Well, I mean, I used to call her Zadie all the time, you know, before I met her. And
now that you know her, do you have to call her full name?
Yeah, I call her Zadie Smith. But you know, like it almost feels weirder that I met her a couple of times, right? Or I guess once, maybe, I don't know. It feels weirder to call her Zadie because it feels like you're like bragging, right? Whereas before there was like an over familiarity with her that lots of people would, just readers would call her Zadie. And, you know, I'm trying to think of, there's surely lots of women writers that you do this with. I mean, Simone, I think, or sometimes you do the full name, but you often just do the first name. And you don't, I mean, correct me if you disagree, but I don't really do that with male writers, right? The closest is like DFW. But
I was about to say DHL and DFW, I think of them as being.
But DFW is still, that's a sort of like baseball player. You know, you're like, put him in, get DFW in there, you know? He's a good pinch hitter. So I wonder if there is like, if it is kind of like a sexism rearing its head or something in this impulse to do it, or we should just reclaim it and we're like, you know, women are intimate with each other for this reason.
I don't know, do you think, I sometimes think the more serious critics do think that I'm letting the side down some way. But I sort of think lean into the stuff the girls are allowed to do, like friendship and intimacy. And I think maybe, I used to think this a lot when I was commissioning, and when I still commission now, I was like, when I give a woman's subject to a woman, am I like letting the woman down, both women down? But then sometimes I think, well, it's sort of like our culture in some level. Like I probably am a difference feminist, as in not a political lesbian or anything, but I feel like it's important that we have our own culture and it's different from male culture. So that might mean doing things like that are risky, that we're going to be looked down on by using first names, but also that might create a little bit of space to talk about how different it is to be a woman. And I mean, the reason it's called A Life in One's Own is because of A Room in One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And I like to remind people, but I suppose hopefully they know this and I don't have to keep saying it after a certain point, but it's not about a room on one's own and £500 a year. It's about all the things that when you try and sit down in that room that you've got for yourself, you've got a lock on the door, you've got £500, you're fine, and then you can't write. And you can't write because centuries of women just haven't written. And you have all these things in your way, like, am I being too much of a girl? Am I being too much of a feminist? Am I doing... And, you know, Woolf goes through them beautifully in that book. And I sometimes think maybe getting around them does mean things like reclaiming certain things that are looked down on and trying to use them in a different way and making them feel different. Yeah.
Well, I also sort of sometimes think, I don't know, I sort of fetishize equality or reciprocity, which is like what I want, like in my career and in my love life. And is it possible? I don't know. But I often feel that actually men should be more like us in those ways specifically, right? Like I'm hearing guys, I'm like, you guys need feminism, like, you know, like, and not this sort of, you know, male feminist kind of stuff or this like trite thing that, oh, what, you know, men benefit from feminism too. I'm like, no, you need to be liberated, like in a special way. And I kind of feel, you know, you're older than I am, but I feel that, you know, when I was growing up, I had all these like teen and women's magazines that were incredibly like ostentatiously empowering, right? And now I sort of feel like, I don't want to talk too much about feminism, but like the feminist moment that we're in is quite depressing because I feel like it's quite regressed. And you've also written a lot about not just women writers, but women sort of pop stars. You just had this big piece on Madonna that came out in the New York Review of Books. And I wonder, and you've also written about Callum Moran and these kind of like, women from the the icons, right? And I feel like this is not really a question, but if you want to say something about it, since you were meaningfully alive in the 90s and I was not, like it's worse now in some ways, or it's like more repressed, or there are more specific ideas about how to be a woman and what you should and shouldn't do. And you and I have talked a lot about plastic surgery, the popularity of Botox, this kind of stuff. And, I wonder if, like, in your writing this book and your other writing, you are trying to, like, forge a new path for feminism, which I know is quite grandiose for a British woman to admit to, but it's a safe space.
I'd love it if that is what the book is doing. I mean, I think part of there were lots of different things that I was thinking about as I was writing it. One was this combination we've been talking about personal criticism and personal biographical writing, both for the writers and myself, as well as criticism more generally. But I wrote it just after I started a small press with a couple of friends called Silver Press, which reprinted different sorts of feminist books, including Audre Lorde and Lauren Oyler Carrington, and just different writers that had just sort of been forgotten about. And I was feeling this sense that there was a tradition that was being lost. And sometimes I feel much closer to second wave feminists, the kind of crunchy, kind of Beauvoirian kind of feminist, because they were starting to think about this difference between equality and difference feminism, what that looks like. And now I sometimes feel a bit like, I felt it all the way through the 90s. There was this lame Spice Girls stuff, but it was still at least around. And there was, it seemed empowering, but actually you thought about what is it empowering to do? And I've just been disappointed in the feminism that's been around me for quite a long time, I suppose, and felt like I haven't really fit anywhere. Like I couldn't do the Ladette stuff. Like I turned up in this with enormous white dress, that's not me. And I don't know where we go forward. I feel like you think about this and get us somewhere.
Well, I mean, I don't know. We were talking about this at lunch, but it's this. One of my sort of hard questions was, what is freedom, right? Like, I feel like I have a lot of freedom, but is that freedom to resist convention, right? It's not about the absence of convention. It's about being able to having room to respond to convention, and so much of the book is about these women, in several cases, like really remarkably resisting convention. And in the case of Beauvoir, in that passage that you read, resisting it emotionally, not because, not for, she really tried. She really had to try. She's sobbing in the corner, drinking like goblets of wine, because she didn't want to succumb to what was expected of her. And I think now in feminism, there's like a sense of like, no, if you feel bad about it, you should just do it, right? Like you should just do what makes you feel good. And I wonder, I don't really know what my question is, but like, let's see, I actually have some notes I can refer to.
I was asking you a question. What you were saying was making me think of maybe the perfect thing is to be able to defy convention and stick to it at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking of like George Eliot's marriage.
Yeah.
Like she lived for a long time with a man who was married to someone else. And they had sort of had to stay married for the Victorian kind of mores at the time and couldn't really get divorced. So she was very scandalous for living with a married man, but at the same time she was having a very ordinary monogamous marriage that was very supportive to her writing. And so it meant, because she was scandalous, certain people stayed away, so she had more time to do what she wanted. But yet she had all the support and the structure of a monogamous marriage. Mm-hmm. So I sort of feel like whenever women can feel they have both things at once, that feels really good.
Well, I like
Obviously,
that part.
I know there's a problem with that.
I like that part where you say that you read and like Beauvoir says it would be artificial to equate Sartre's absence with her own freedom because she wanted him around, right? And there's like a limit to the amount of suffering, like, you know, honorable suffering one can endure before it's actually hurting you. But this also sort of touches on emotions, right? And being overcome with emotions. Plath says at one point that she's pathetically intense, right? And I think you often too, I think at the beginning you talk about like you're going through your divorce and your mother's just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and you say that you were surprised by your emotions all the time. And I wonder what a sort of feminist use of emotion in writing looks like for you, or how do you balance, like, you know, these waves of emotions caused by our crazy hormones with, like, you know, being a serious, rigorous reader and writer, and as you just suggested, it's important to have some kind of stability so that you can sit down and do your work, right?
I don't know that I managed that particularly well. What I ended up doing and ended up doing in my essays and in this book is being more honest about it. So there are several points in the book where I tell you I'm cried and I couldn't continue carrying on. There was a section around Plath's kind of, when Plath discovers that Ted Hughes is cheating on her, and the pleading letters that she writes to people for help were I was in tears myself. And I sometimes feel a bit like, one is the experience we want from reading and art, I think. One of the experiences, to be moved in certain ways, or to feel, to lose ourselves in certain ways. Like, I wasn't crying straightforwardly for myself. I wasn't crying straightforwardly with Plath. There was some kind of like something there, and that seemed to me interesting and worth analysing. So sometimes I just get really upset. And then I go back and realize, like, how did that work? How did the piece of writing work? Why, in that particular point in the story, people sometimes write to me and tell me that things that I've written have upset them too. So I'm interested in observing when it happens and why, and then thinking about it later. I do often feel like a certain, it's not just crying, there are other emotions too, like feeling, and I feel like bringing those into the writing and either just registering them and saying one can be emotional in this realm too. I can be more honest about what sort of critic I am or what's going on with my life. But I do think, you know, I have editors sometimes cut out bits of that and said, that's enough. Don't tell us that you were drinking rosé while you were reading the book. Don't tell us that you were crying when that happened. Just stop. And I'm usually quite grateful for that. So sometimes I just, in my drafts, let all of that come out and then rely on my editors to kind of help me and look after me in that way. I sometimes think I didn't really cry enough when I was younger or something. Something weird happened. Like, my therapist was often saying, why aren't you angry? Why don't you cry? Why don't you cry more? And maybe that's to do with being English. I don't know. But so I'm actually fine with it. Though I just sometimes get a bit embarrassed about it. And I think I had this book and you can all see bits of my life that were really difficult and that other people might see as shameful, I guess. But I often think it was worth it. I never feel like that close to writers when they're perfect. I feel so much closer to them when they're doing something a bit wrong or they're struggling. And I guess I wanted that for my reader, to be able to, like, not think of me as this person with all these bylines in these fancy magazines, and that actually a person that that could be their friend too, I suppose, maybe.
So a lot of these, I don't know how many of them, but a lot of them started as magazine pieces, mostly in the two of them. Okay. So did you? How did I guess this would have been a question for the beginning, but how did the book start? Right. So you wrote the Beauvoir and the Sylvia Plath one, right, for the LRB. It was that sort of the beginning of the book project for you, that you were just, you wanted to write about these figures because there was some relevant book that came out, and then it just went from there? How did it begin?
The first was The Plath, and that had just been, that came out as a kind of a long piece, and that it came out because Faber and Echo here, I think, in America, published her whole letters together, these 2 enormous volumes. They found letters that had never been published before. And that's, I guess, when I started that kind of method of reading everything in one go. And when that came out, people had a strong reaction to it. And I guess, I don't know, I tried some of the stuff out we've been talking about. Like, I have the end of that essay, I imagine what Plath would be like if she's still alive. There's lots of people think that it was sort of an accident that she killed herself then, that she was on the wrong drugs and she took them on the wrong day. And it's very possible that that didn't happen. And I was like, well, what would it happen if I went to the Faber party and she was in the loo and I was there, and allowed myself that freedom with her work. And some of it was about approaching her again, like after being 16, 17, when my mother first gave me a copy of her collected poems for Christmas, and thinking about what is it like when I read her again, and felt like she was completely new, that I'd forgotten that she had this whole like exuberant post-divorce moment where she bought all these clothes and she had these dates and she was like writing these crazy letters and just having a lot of fun, like traveling. And I was like, oh, this is a completely different Plath to what I saw before. She's like, she's resurrected herself. I mean, and I think a lot of Plath scholars think that now. They concentrate on those moments when she rises again, right? Like, I've had obviously her famous poem, but Lady Lazarus. And so I was really interested in seeing these women writers differently and realizing that they were different to what I thought. The Beauvoir came after, again, because she was a figure that I had carried with me for a long time. And then after that, colleagues said to me, oh, you're doing something you didn't realize you were doing. And then the sort of book came together. I'm ashamed to say this, but sort of quickly, I realised what it could be, that it could start in the 18th century with Mary Wollstonecraft and finish with Elena Ferrante is not dead, that it would have these sections of my life going through it, that it would have biographical, critical together, and it just seemed, and that also that I could choose. I didn't get to choose all the things I write about, so it was very exciting to be like, oh, what about Woolf? I mean, but you remember that essay. I was finding it awful to write that one because I was scared. And also I wanted writers of colour to be on the same level as white women writers, and there to be like a mini canon that you could learn a lot about women's writing historically over different cultures, over in a short span of a book, right, that hopefully you can read without too much pain.
Was it hard to structure in the personal anecdotes? Because so the structure, it's sort of chronological, more or less, right? But via like the careers of the writers. But your personal narrative is woven, as we say in the business. So I wonder if that part was more like, did you write each essay on their own? Did you have to move those personal parts around to see where each one fit? I feel like the chapter where you talk about your mother, I was like, oh, I would have thought maybe she would talk about that in a different chapter, sort of things like this. So I just wonder if that was more difficult, or that also just came together really quickly.
I should have had you read the draft. That part changed a lot after I finished the first draft, and I handed it to my editors to read, partly because my mother died like a month after I finished the manuscript. And so there was this really weird moment where I handed in the book, had like a month, and then my mother was failing, and I spent 2 weeks at her bedside in England, and then 2 weeks after, and then I got COVID. So there was a really weird moment where I was thinking a lot about how to make this book better, how to bring the personal in, and it felt very soon to write about my mother's death. But at the same time, she meant a great deal to me, and I thought it may be important to try and register some of that in the book at the time that I was doing it. There are sections of the book that I don't like reading because I start crying. And I think maybe some of that is because it was very, very close to her death. So those sections happened in that period of rewriting where often I went further into it than I did in the first draft, and I don't regret them But yeah, and in fact, I'm sort of happy that some of these moments are caught. That's the weird thing about a book. Like, it came out, not only it was published like last year, but it was written like 6 months before that. So in some ways it feels very current. In other ways, that's like she died 2 years ago now. So it's a different sort of thing. I wonder what I would write now if I was finishing this book now about it. Yeah.
I have one more question, then we can do some audience questions, but this is also a Paris-related question. So I think last time we did an interview about this book, I asked you, was there anyone you wanted to include and you didn't? And you said Annie Ernaux, and you have written about her not in the book. And I remember when she won the Nobel Prize, you texted me, and it was something like, you were like, I'm so happy, one of ours. And one of ours won. And I was wondering what you meant by that.
I meant how a woman with a book that is literally like stalking her lover for a whole book has won the Nobel Prize. So I'm not sure it's complimentary to either of us. But I meant like someone who values female experience to write about it in that detail. Someone who values girlhood. Someone who values being an older woman, being like a divorced woman, being their parents in this particular way, and like finding interest in her own life to that degree, to write it and mine it over that time. Annie's another writer who, again, I could probably call Annie and feel very close to. Like I feel like I understand something about her work almost sometimes instinctively, without having having to read lots of criticism about it. That it makes sense to me that she would return to a moment in her girlhood and write a beautiful, slim book about it. Her book about abortion has, I've read that several times, and it has all these different. It seems quite straightforward in some ways, and in other ways it's incredibly complex and has lots of different feelings about that, and yet makes it very clear that obviously that right should be continuous for everybody across space and time. So that's what I thought. Did you think that I was taking a liberty?
What, with me?
Yeah. Did you think she's not one of mine?
She's not one of mine. But I understand. I mean, I understand what you mean. And like, she is like one of my, in that way, especially now you explain it that way, as I'm like psychologically preparing to bear all, I suppose, in my next book. But no, it's the thing that I feel often about women writers today. This is, it's like I want more words in there.
You think Annie writes too short?
Yes, and not enough about each thing. Like I want more. I'm just a maximalist. It's not a good moment. It's not been a good moment for me for many years, right? But I feel like my favorite. I think we had a conversation. What's your favorite chapter? And I was like, oh, Virginia Woolf is mine. She's mine, and yours is.
I think mine was Plath, but I think in some ways you can't really. I mean, obviously you're not supposed to choose.
Why? You're an artist. You can do whatever you want. It's great.
But then I think it's for sentimental reasons, because she was the first. Because I still have that collected poems on my desk. Like I still go back to her writing like really frequently. And yet I still sort of think that she would hate me. I don't know. It's a weird, weird relationship.
Yeah. Can we have a final round of applause, please, for our speakers? We're now going to be opening this up to questions. So we'll start with our in-person audience, and if we have time, we'll see what's happening in the Zoom chat as well. So in-person audience, turning it over to you, raise your hand very high, and I'll bring you the microphone, and someone has already raised their hand. So here they come.
Thank you. Hi, I thought everything you guys said was super interesting. I am currently writing, and I'm also reading a lot as I write, which is normal. I have a question, because what you guys are saying about female writers speaking to other women through the words that they write is so true, and it really like resonates with what I'm going through, or how I'm approaching my writing right now. But I'm also intimately aware that like the writing that influenced me the most in my youth and the characters that influenced me the most in my youth were probably written by men. So I'm just wondering, who were the characters potentially written by men, still women, who spoke to you, or maybe they were male characters, and can a female character written by a man touch us or teach us things about ourselves in the same way that a woman writer writing about her own life can?
Oh my God, I love that question. I was suddenly like, oh, I can't think of one. Then I remembered Tess the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, thank you. I felt like I knew her, and I almost feel like she's not quite written by a man in like a deep way. Like that was the first book, like grown-up book that I just was reading into the night and just couldn't put down. I really love to reread it because I wonder if it comes across as like melodramatic now. But I think she's amazing, and also, I mean, D.H. Lawrence, like so many characters in D.H. Lawrence feel like real women that I know and I would talk to and that I could bring down and ask advice from and drink with. Do you have some, Lauren?
Well, when I was young, I just read like YA. I didn't read a real book until I went to college. So I read like YA, and so those were all written by women because I don't do the fantasy stuff. I never did that. Like, it's not real. There's no such thing. And then like what? By the time you're 18, I don't know. I was like at an elite university, and I didn't know what I was doing because I grew up as I suggested.
Did you not do anything for school?
Yeah, we read like The Great Gatsby, and you know what I mean. It was really like I'm from not quite rural West Virginia, but you know, it's not like we're reading The Great Gatsby in like senior year of high school, which is not really. You should be reading other stuff, I think. So no. And then when I went to college, I was like trying to read the way that you're supposed to read because I had no idea what was going on. And like I just remember reading Lolita, right? Which is it's not really something you want to
actually.
identify
Lots of
with.
women writers my age and younger have an intense relationship with Lolita, not quite knowing. Sort of when you read it very young, you sort of emulate her. You have this draw towards her. There's lots of different things.
Just was like, I love this writer. You know what I mean? Like, I think it was because I was so out of context in that environment anyway that I never like read classics like that because I didn't know what was going on. I was like an idiot. I was stupid. Like I didn't know. I was like, how do I read this so that I can get a grade? I'm serious. Like I didn't know how to write a paper or anything. So I was really reading it. Like really, you know, like what does this novel mean? Like what is it? What can we? I was close reading. Also, I went to Yale. This is like it's a very close reading place. So yeah, but I also read Plath. I think when I was probably 20, and that was great. Yeah, sorry if that's an avoidant answer.
I would like to know which ones the characters are interesting to you. Actually, too.
Tess is absolutely like changed my life, and then Isabel Archer from Henry James. I actually think I'm like living in Paris in part because of her. So yeah,
maybe Jane Eyre. Actually, but I did write a paper on that, which doesn't count. You know, I wrote a paper about it, but you know, she's a bit meta as well. The reader address, and I think, unfortunately, I identify with a star-crossed, probably doomed relationship. So that's actually probably Jane Eyre.
Great.
Trapped,
Great.
working among rich people.
Great.
I'm
going to assign that piece when I next get a chance.
Other questions?
Yes.
You beautifully let your life flow into the lives of the 9 women. And I'm wondering, when you are at your lowest, who comes to you? Who is whispering in your ear for support? And when you are at your highest, who is cheering you forward?
That's a really lovely question. I honestly, probably my mother. Now that she's dead, she's like in my head at those high moments and the low ones. The other person I think of is Toni Morrison, the sort of strength that she had to manage all the different parts of her life and say to the world, like, it's fine, you can handle it. You can be an editor, a writer, novelist, mother. You don't have to give up parts of your life to like be a full person. So sometimes I think of her strength, but really it's like my mother's voice, an idealized version of my mother. Like she wasn't perfect. But thank you for that question. It's very sweet.
Other questions? Don't be shy. We have lots of time.
I'm fine with comments too. Some people ban comments. I'm like, why not? They're great.
Share what you think, guys. Speak your mind.
Hi, thank you both. I wanted to ask about books that you revisit all the time, the favorite books that you'd like to reread, but also what are some of the books that you are hesitant to reread because you had a really good experience with them and you want to keep it special or for another reason?
I have a Jane Austen book in reserve that I haven't read. A kind of guilty admission. Never read Emma. So I read Persuasion like 5 times. And look at you. I read Persuasion 5 times. I read Pride and Prejudice loads. And Emma is the one that I have been like half keeping thinking, oh, well, I need an Austen. I can't like live my life having read all of them. And I know there were drafts. I know there were letters and I could get into that. But so Emma is like my guilty one that I haven't read. I've read the Bell Jar. So I've read the Persuasion. I read the Persuasion nearly every year. So Persuasion I've read like, at the moment I'm sort of reading it every Christmas. So like 5 or 6 times, and then the Bell Jar the same. I don't really know why the Bell Jar, it really isn't like her best work, but I do reread it often. It's got a coolness to it, hasn't it? Like you open it and you're like, okay, fine, and you're like finish it very easily. But Persuasion is more of a, I don't know. I almost feel like forget the plot and reread it and think, oh my god, I can't believe that X knew Y and Z and they didn't know. Anyway, yeah, I love that book. Yeah, of course.
Oh. Now, what do I reread? I mean, I just reread Pale Fire, which is like, it's, you know, his whole thing is the only real reading is rereading. But that book you have to reread several times. I reread, I mean, I feel like I talk about this book all the time and it's embarrassing because then it became a New York Times article, which is Mating. Also a great female character written by a man. But I feel like I reread that because it's so open. It's like the opposite of what you just said about the Bell Jar. It's so open and so easy, but it's like like this. The language is so technical, and the voice is so singular and like perfectly what it is. And also it's a quest. A wonderful quest novel. And I wanted to ask you actually, because there was that quote from one of your reviews that the book was part memoir, part history, part quest. And I wondered, is all writing a quest?
Well, some of the great genres are, right? Like a Bildungsroman and Künstlerroman.
But a quest for like some sort of knowledge or like understanding or solace or something more spiritual.
Yeah, like if this book is a quest, I guess it's like for the kind of feeling of some feeling of being at home intellectually, I think. But I sometimes think a quest could just simply be for truth. A lot of things I read, I'm like, that's not really how life is. Like, it's surprising how often you pick up a book, non-fiction or fiction, you think, oh, that doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like how life is. And so I often think, like, as a writer, I'm thinking, how can I make this as truthful? How can I make this as truthful as I can? How can I get the complexity of life on the page, I guess?
You said also, you put this in your bio, so you're writing or written a novel. Is that a quest also?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. It is. It's more. It's like a Bildungsroman, actually. I think.
Yeah.
Now I've sort of pulling it apart to rewrite it. I'm realizing that all those very classic, almost Jane Eyre-ian themes are in there, and that feels right to me. Like it's a sort of becoming. I suppose the only thing about a Bildungsroman that feels false is that you get to a point where you're finished, and you're basically never finished as a person or in life. I think. Yeah.
Can we have a final round of applause? Thank you both so much. Lauren, it's such a treat to have you back in the reading room. You are brilliant. Miss Biggs, you're fantastic as well. It's been a big night, and that was a pun. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. If this is your first time, I'm glad that that joke landed with some people. If this is your first time, please do have a look at our calendar to see our other upcoming events. We are wrapping up for the season, so don't miss your last opportunities to see some brilliant thinkers, artists, writers. We're going to have Adam Schatz with Claire Denis next week. We'll have Adam again with Jake Lamar. Kristen Campbell tomorrow will be appearing with Cornelius Tulloch to speak about art and diaspora. So I highly encourage you to stop by again and spend a lovely summer evening with us. And finally, copies of A Life of One's Own are now available for sale just outside, and Joanna may even sign a copy or two if she's feeling generous, so I highly encourage you to go and purchase them. Thank you so much again, and have a lovely evening. I hope to see you soon.